Ladies and gentlemen, I have stumbled upon what looks to be an amazing video in my recommended. YouTube actually pushed a good video in my algorithm, and I could not be happier. I've noticed that my videos are also doing better lately, as is my recommended. Like, I'm just getting better videos recommended to me, while my videos are also doing better. I imagine that is not a coincidence. So I'm happy to see that things are starting to finally return to normal when it comes to YouTube just fucking over all its creators as of late. And with that, I can proudly say I found a good video essay. At least the bits of it that I saw were pretty good. And the title and thumbnail, damn, they're bangers. Let me tell you. You see, this video is by a smaller channel named Max Morrow. This video's blown up in the last 2 weeks, 26,000 views, pretty big for that 26 times the channel's sub count. That's pretty good. The video's called Trump, Asmongold, and the Danger of Common Sense Politics, quote unquote. I have wanted to make a video that is like exactly this for a while now, and to see that someone else has sort of done it already, you'd think it'd make me feel like, they stole my idea, or I should have gotten to it first. In reality, I just feel a strong sense of catharsis that somebody is saying exactly what I've been thinking. And I figure we ought to take a watch at this video because Asmongold and his ilk have been arguably some of the most destructive individuals in the landscape of politics towards the general critical thinking abilities of the broader population. So, a deep takedown on the way that he engages with politics, sign me up, bro. Link to the original video down below. Go send some support. I'd appreciate it if you did. Maybe even drop a like and a comment on this video too. Subscribe if you're new as well, and I'd appreciate that. Let's get right into it though. No more further ado. The Danger of Common Sense Politics.
By the way, am I, do you guys feel the same way? Am I the only person? Because I feel like this is the common sense take to have. Whereas if you're new, you're not going to have that same type of insight.
This is going to be a good
that's
compilation.
Common sense, man. It's such a, this is the thing. It's so common sense. Of course they're going to think that. Obviously, they're going to think that. It's common sense. And so I appreciate, you know, at least standing on common fucking sense. So on both sides, you don't know? Well, yeah, of course, everybody knows that. It's common sense. This is a huge victory for, what do you call it? A huge victory for common sense.
You're starting to see it now, right?
Common sense. But to be honest, this is a common sense reality that any reasonable, intelligent person would have come to. On his behalf, they're getting in battles on behalf of common sense. I'm not going to cry a fucking river when people who have genocide that's baked into their laws are getting genocided. Yeah, I mean, it's common sense when you think about it. I don't give a fuck. They're terrible people. It's not even a question. It's common sense, exactly. It's just common sense. They'd be doing the same thing. This is common sense. They're not able to kill as many people as Israel because they don't have as many bombs and as many weapons. But if they did, they'd be doing the same thing. You would need to do this. It's common sense. These people are not your allies. They come from an inferior culture that is horrible. It kills people for their
He's talking about Palestinians, by the way.
Identity, and it is directly antithetical to everything Western values stand for, and it is an inferior culture in all ways. Sorry. It's just common sense.
When I saw this intro, I knew we had to watch this on stream, because I've made this argument so many times that Asmongold's style of politics is so attractive to people. The reason he's #1 in the world of politics right now, the most popular political streamer, is because this kind of political engagement is so bottom of the barrel, so pandering to the lowest common denominator. You should expect it to be unbelievably effective, because he is pandering to the lowest common denominator after all. And this means that you don't really need to put in any effort to making a genuine, substantiated argument. At the end of the day, you can just say, it's common sense. And this same logic is exactly what Trump has been using. I'm sure this video won't shy away from showing the many clips of Trump claiming that the things he fights for are just common sense. He loves to use that phrase.
Hey guys, Asmongold's biggest fan Max here, and I've been loving 2 words in politics lately. Common sense. It's always been this sort of nebulous term which conservatives have loved alluding to, but right now in 2025, with God Emperor Trump back in the White House, its usage has exploded. It all started at his inaugural speech on the 20th of January this year, where he declared,
"With these actions, we will begin the complete restoration of America and the revolution of common sense." It's all about common sense.
Well, okay, I'm not gonna lie, that does sound kinda exciting, so...
The fact is, nobody immediately bristles up when they hear it's common sense. No one has any negative connotation with that word. It might be one of the most positively connotated words there is. Ah, yes, someone's using common sense? That's quite good, yes, indubitably. So, appropriating that term, that's so universally agreeable. I mean, it's like if you appropriated puppies and rainbows. The right argues the left appropriated rainbows. Like, it's hard to be against those things, unless you're a conservative, I guess, because they do hate rainbows. And I guess Kristi Noem does shoot puppies. Wow, I really fucked up that analogy, didn't I?
What was step one gonna be in this common sense revolution? Well, 10 days later, when 67 people were killed in a mid-air collision between a passenger plane and military helicopter, Trump was ready to put his plan into action. At a press conference addressing the incident with absolutely zero evidence to support him, Trump decided to blame the crash on DEI policies, as apparently there were pilots being hired who had
severe intellectual and psychiatric disabilities. That is amazing.
Amazing!
That's right. Even though the investigation had barely begun, Trump's galaxy brain and infinite wisdom had already determined the true cause. Now, when a reporter asked him how he possibly could have come to that conclusion not even 24 hours after the crash, Trump simply responded,
"Because I have common sense, okay? And unfortunately, a lot of people don't."
Wow. And they said the revolution wasn't going to be televised. But okay, that press conference was 6 months ago, and hey, look.
What's so stark about that, by the way, is that Donald Trump was blatantly lying there as well, and just saying, oh, it's common sense to the media in order to get them off his back, to explain away why he would say something so demonstrably false. At the end of the day, like, it's just common sense is the argument people make when they're too lazy to explain the logic behind what they're doing. Even if it is just common sense, you should probably be able to explain why it's common sense. Oftentimes they can't. It's just a scapegoat phrase.
A lot more details about the crash have been released since then. We now know the helicopter had a malfunctioning altimeter, there was a communication breakdown between the pilots, and air control staff failed to deliver vital emergency instructions. These were all contributing factors, and although we still have to wait until early next year to get the full report, do you want to know which claim still has zero credible evidence to support it? Yeah, that whole DEI thing Trump said. As it turns out,
whenever the right starts proudly proclaiming some new news story is the thing that proves their worldview is right, once again, you can always assume it's bullshit, but you should double check just in case. But almost always, when I hear a conservative say this thing that sounds super far-fetched and frankly sounds like conservative fanfiction happened, I rarely will ever take them at their word that that happened, because if I Google it and look into it, that's often not the case. Like, they're constantly blowing up stories like this and pushing them as some sort of right-wing propaganda vessel, and then they drop the story once it stops having any clickability or interest, and oftentimes later on we find out, oh yeah, that was all entirely bullshit. But it never gets tread on again. That topic never gets covered. No one ever talks about the fact that, once again, another thing the right said, another thing Trump said for months has been proven undeniably false, but there's no consequences because no one cares anymore.
Using your common sense to decipher deeply complex situations like, oh, I don't know, mid-air collisions between aircraft isn't a particularly effective way of arriving at the truth. Yet for some strange reason, common sense has become this absolute rallying cry for the MAGA movement, and in my estimation, it's having a pretty corrosive effect on political discourse. Like, if you want to see the impact of it in real time, look no further than the most popular political streamer in the world right now, and our good friend who happened to feature in the intro to this video, Asmongold.
The mold
It honestly baffles me that one of the most influential voices in online politics right now is a gamer who spends 6 hours a day vomiting out common sense drivel based on cherry-picked Twitter clips and submissions to his own fucking subreddit.
I've said this before, but anytime I feel a tinge of imposter syndrome, like the Green Goblin side of my personality is telling me, Norman, you'll never be good enough to be a big YouTuber. You know, whenever I've got that, you know, the Green Goblin mask is talking to me, I always just remind myself, wait a minute, Asmongold is literally the largest political pundit in the world of internet content creation and streaming. If that guy can be literally the biggest, I think I'll be fine. I think I'll be fine. And that's at least comforting. Like, Asmongold being so successful is comforting in a sense. That, like, something so bottom of the barrel and low effort can be that successful. Because if he can do it with content that shit, then so can I.
So unbelievably fucked if that is the scope of our political engagement, but we won't start the Asmongold hate posting just yet. So, fellow truth seekers, come join me on a journey to understand the extremely ideological, dogmatic, and ultimately flawed way of thinking which is holding conservative brains captive. So okay, before we can dive into any of the fun stuff, I think it's first important that we understand what is actually meant by the term common sense. As I allude to in the intro, it's a pretty nebulous phrase which means different things to different people, and that can make pinpointing an exact definition
positive,
a little challenging. But with that being said, I think Duncan Watts, a social scientist who has written extensively on this topic, offers us a pretty good starting point. Roughly speaking, common sense is the loosely organized set of facts, observations, experiences, insights, and pieces of received wisdom that each of us accumulates over a lifetime in the course of encountering, dealing with, and learning from everyday situations. Now, there's a lot to unpack there, but I think the most important place to start is the fact that common sense is very intuitive and practical by nature. For example, we'd say it's common sense to let everyone out of an elevator before you get in one, it's common sense to look both ways before you cross the road, and it's common sense to say please and thank you when somebody does something for you. These are all things the average person picks up in their day-to-day life as they observe other people in society complying with these norms.
And keep in mind, by the way, there's a fundamental difference between real common sense and what the right calls common sense. Take, for instance, why shouldn't you walk across the street without looking both ways? It's common sense that you should look both ways? Well, but why? Because you might get hit by a car if you don't see one coming. That's a good answer. Okay. That makes sense, right? Like, you can answer why it's common sense not to look both ways before crossing the street. But if you ask a conservative who says it's common sense that trans people are not valid, if you ask them, well, how's that common sense? What do you mean by that? They're not going to be able to give a very good, satisfactory explanation of why it's common sense. If something's actually common sense, it should take like a sentence or two to explain why that's the case. When it comes to the claims the right makes, they couldn't, if they were asked or forced to elaborate further than just saying it's common sense, bro, their arguments would fall apart. Common sense is a placeholder for an argument they don't have, or an argument they do have but recognize as weak.
Once you get that type of practical wisdom, it just becomes a subconscious response in the future. You know, once you burn your hand on a hot stove, you hopefully don't have to think too hard about doing it again. And look, in your day-to-day life, I'm not going to sit here and argue that that isn't a valuable thing to have. There's good reason as to why we associate so many positive connotations with this type of common sense, as the people who have it tend to be sensible, they make good decisions, and they lead stable lives. You know, I don't think we'd have a functioning society if everybody acted like that one friend who doesn't see a problem with going on 2 a.m. alcohol-fueled side quests with the handful of strangers they just met at a bar. So when we're dealing with our interpersonal lives, common sense is unquestionably a very valuable thing to have, and I think you'd be hard-pressed to find literally anybody who disagrees with that. So okay, if it can be such a good thing, then why am I clowning on our good friend Asmongold and his common sense Israel-Palestine takes? Well, if we loop back to that initial definition for a moment, you'll notice two key words at the end there. Everyday situations. Yes, when we're waiting in line at the shops, taking the bus to work, or eating at a restaurant, we should rely on our
Eating out a restaurant? Hey, yo! That's freaky, okay. Alright, I won't judge, I won't kink shame.
Common sense to govern our behavior. However, the second we start to scale up those intuitions from one-on-one interactions to, I don't know, government policy aimed at resolving complex issues on a societal level, well, we're gonna run into some pretty significant issues.
Fundamentally, common sense, real common sense, is derived from lived experience, your own lived experience, what you know to be true and to be a smart or bad decision based on your mistakes and successes you've had in your life. And so when a conservative appeals to common sense, it's not just a placeholder for an argument they don't have or an argument they do have that's weak. It's also a very strong evocation of someone's personal experience. You're telling people, well, hey, think to your own personal experience. Your own lived experience wouldn't lead you wrong, right? What you've seen or heard with your own eyes and ears. You're going to trust some scientist or sociologist to tell you what's true? Come on, what's the common sense? What do your eyes tell you? What does your lived experience tell you? And so you make it very personal for people when you invoke common sense. Because if someone's instincts are wrong, then surely they lack common sense. That's probably how a lot of people engage with this idea. And I think that's how this psychological trick has become so effective.
To get an idea of what I'm talking about here, I want to show you this fantastic clip I found between common sense warrior, man of the people Piers Morgan, and evolutionary biologist Richard
hate
Dawkins.
Piers
They were having
Morgan
a
so
discussion
much.
about the creation of the universe, and
I cannot stand Piers Morgan. I'm gonna be having a rough time for this next clip.
trying to wrap his head around the Big Bang, Piers asked this.
Well, someone as logical as you are, and I believe you are, you think about this all very logically. A logical mind surely has to appreciate that before the Big Bang, there has to have been something before then. Otherwise, what is nothing?
And hey, that seems like a fair enough
There's
question.
no
As someone
before the
who
Big Bang.
also doesn't know jack shit about astrophysics or the creation of the universe, the idea of something coming from nothing feels rather unintuitive. So, let's see what Richard Dawkins has to say in response.
I'm trying to tell you what a physicist would say first of all. They would say that you cannot use the word before for the Big Bang. Time began at the Big Bang. There was no before the Big Bang. I know it's contrary to common sense. Physicists don't necessarily deal with common sense.
It's one of my favorite things ever to think about. Like, what? The fact that there was nothing before there was something, we call it before the Big Bang, but there was no before. Like, there wasn't time, there wasn't space, there wasn't energy, there wasn't anything. So, like, thinking about that concept, thinking about nothing, it's the same as thinking about what you would likely experience before existing, before birth or before conception, and after your death. Like, it's really hard to imagine, like, what a non-existing, like, reality is like, in the same way that it's hard to imagine what your consciousness ceasing to be is like. It's really hard to imagine it because you can't. It's literally impossible. And I'm going to guess that does not vibe well with Piers Morgan's common sense worldview. God, I hate him so much.
Big Bang. I know it's contrary to common sense. Physicists don't necessarily deal with common sense.
Oh my god, did you hear that? Richard Dawkins is suggesting that maybe our intuitions are a little misguided when it comes to something as deeply complex as the creation of the universe itself. Who could have possibly guessed that? Also, as a bit of context, Dawkins does sound a little passive-aggressive here, but that's only because Piers had been interrupting him moments before.
But whatever it was, it
But it
got
has
the
to,
discourse.
doesn't it?
You
Piers
cannot
Morgan?
suddenly invoke.
Doesn't it have to?
Anyway, now that Dawkins has highlighted the inaccessibility of this topic for mere laymen, let's see what illuminating response Piers conjures up next.
Well, it makes no sense, does it? And that's what I mean. As you're a logical man, that cannot make sense to you. The idea that you're not even allowed to use the word before the Big Bang, when
I love that right there. Perfect example of how the right these grifters love to twist things and frame things in a very dishonest and clickbaity way. Did you see him make that concept clickbaity? Well, we don't say before the Big Bang because there was no time or anything before the Big Bang. Piers Morgan turns that into, you're not allowed to say before the Big Bang. He has to imply there's some, like, a lot of conspiracy theorists and anti-science folks, like the flat earthers and, like, the aliens built the pyramids type people, have been claiming you're not allowed to say this in the world of archaeology or geology. I don't know how many of you guys watch Mini Minuteman, Milo Rossi. He makes great content. Highly recommend you check out his stuff. But you'll see a lot of examples of that kind of exact rhetoric, where it's people using very conspiratorial, they, quote-unquote, kind of language about history and science, and it's so weird. You know, the way they'll actively try to turn something pretty dry and boring into something shocking. Google debunkers rise, indeed. I'm a proud Google debunker.
Part of both of our brains tells us that that's obviously nonsensical.
It makes no sense, does it? Wow. Thank you, common sense champion Piers Morgan, for making his exact fucking point. Unsurprisingly, the realm of theoretical astrophysics doesn't lend itself to neat little common sense explanations, especially on debate shows where the host is actively seeking confrontation to maximize entertainment value. I think the most telling part about this conversation is the fact that Dawkins preempts it entirely with his initial response.
This is a question for a physicist, not a biologist.
He knows to stay in his own lane from the get-go, and you can see how visibly frustrated he gets as Piers continues to try and poke and prod for an easy explanation, which simply doesn't exist. Now,
the sad thing is, people who actually care about, like, truth and being honest rarely want to step out of their lane, even if doing so would allow them to counter blatant misinformation. And that's the big, like, disadvantage truth has against lies. Liars are willing to say whatever the fuck people will believe at any given time with absolutely no moral hang-ups over it. Nothing will hold them back from doing that. Truth tellers will oftentimes be like, well, I'd like to debunk that, but it's not my area of expertise, so I think I'd better not tackle that topic. It'd be irresponsible to do so. It's like, that difference right there speaks volumes. Like, that alone tells you everything you need to know about the breakdown politically of these situations.
Obviously, this is more of a scientific example rather than a political one, but I think the general premise still rings true. To put it simply, our intuitions are not to be trusted in the task of deciphering complexity. Now, you may argue that something like theoretical astrophysics is much more abstract than politics and has a higher bar to entry, but this could not be further from the truth. When we enter the realm of the social sciences with disciplines like economics, sociology, and politics, we are studying the way in which millions and millions of people interact with one another inside of these massive systems. That introduces a world of complexity which our little peanut brains and its primal intuitions can't even begin to comprehend without a lot of care and nuance. For example, let's take a topic.
This is true, and fundamentally what's so fucking painful about this era of politics, it feels like the flood of shorts and TikToks and, like, brain rot memes has lowered people's level of engagement mentally with topics to whatever is the most clickbaity and interesting. I have seen friends of mine that I have known to be pretty reasonable, like, just not super conspiratorial people, falling for surprisingly obviously nonsense talking points that are just bouncing around in the popular media right now, because, like, just so much of everyone's media consumption right now, if they're not, like, decidedly super left-wing, so much of everyone's media consumption right now is chock full of over-sensationalizing, or sensationalizing, I guess, of everything. Even the most mundane things, like who built the pyramids. That's fairly mundane. It should not be that exciting of a topic, you know, like old history. Now we've got multi-million sub-channels on YouTube claiming aliens did it using sound vibration waves. This is a problem. People's brains are getting rotted by the internet. And it's not like the idea of the internet that's doing it. It's not screens that are doing it. Like, I'm not trying to come off like a boomer here. It's that the culture online is continuously rewarding and incentivizing, and not disincentivizing, being an idiot. Engaging with politics or any given issue like an idiot. Only being willing to engage with anything on the most surface of surface levels is not something that people really call out as dumb anymore. And I think that's been very destructive.
Like managing the consequences of climate change. At the heart of this issue is a balancing act between the need to protect and preserve our natural environment with the need to grow the economy. There's a clear tension between those two things, which are both very important when it comes to ensuring the prosperity of a nation and some type of balance needs to be struck between them. So what does that look like in terms of policy? Do you try a carbon tax to make polluting more costly? What effect does that have on inflation for everyday consumers? Might that reduce consumption and therefore stall economic development? Should you give tax credits to businesses which use renewable sources of energies? What about investing more into the research and development of future technologies? Additionally, you also have to consider the international element there is to climate change as well. It's a global problem which requires every nation to pull their weight, but this introduces a free rider problem to the mix. One country may set ambitious targets to reduce the CO2 they emit, whilst another may double down on their emissions to grow their economy.
Basically, what he's saying here is that these topics are way too nuanced for the average dumbass online to be able to engage with, and so the right wing's like one and done explanations for these topics are far more appealing to people who don't want to spend too much brain power thinking about anything
more rapidly. That's the exact reason Trump withdrew from the Paris Climate Agreement in 2017, as, rightly or wrongly, probably wrongly, he felt as though other nations were taking advantage of the United States and their efforts to reduce emissions. I mean, fuck, just look at this 2012 banger from the Don on Twitter. The concept of global warming was created by and for the Chinese in order to make US manufacturing non-competitive. And look,
that was the thing that Trump was most hurt by, believe it or not, going into the 2016 election. A lot of even Trump supporters had to admit that was a cringe take. Believe it or not, being a denier of climate change was not as popular as it is today 10 years ago. 10 years ago, being a climate change denier was kind of embarrassing. Like, you had to do it in a very clever, sort of underhanded way to not look blatantly stupid.
That's barely even scratching the surface when it comes to climate change and its implications, and can you see how much you have to know just to start to even understand the complexity at play here? There are so many different disciplines intersecting when it comes to these issues, with their own respective experts and academics who've spent their entire lives educating themselves, and personally, I don't think your baseline level intuitions hold a candle to that level of complexity. You know, when One Nation, a far-right party here in Australia, has a page on their website labeled Net Zero Common Sense, it kind of has me scratching my head because I don't really understand which part of anything we just talked about could be properly understood through the lens of common sense. That type of language is massively reductive.
The befuddling of people on the left, like when their arguments are so stupid it just leaves you speechless, that's kind of the point. Or maybe not, maybe they didn't intend for that, but it's definitely not hurting them. Because if you're just so speechless at how stupid what the right is claiming and believing, then, well, you're not effectively debunking what they're saying. You're not effectively convincing anyone it's wrong, because you're just too blown away by how stupid it is to be able to put together a coherent argument.
And dismisses any level of nuance which political issues like climate change absolutely demand. Alright, I hope everyone enjoyed that entree of climate change, because it's now time to get to the mouth-watering main course of immigration. This is one of the most polarizing issues in global politics today, and it's a place where we see a lot of painful fucking discourse. To get an idea of what I'm talking about, let's run through some of the common sense talking points you'll hear from a conservative. Illegal immigrants are stealing jobs from native-born workers, they reduce the wages of working class people as they're willing to work for less money, and they drive up house prices because they need somewhere to stay. I think that's a...
All of those claims are false. On the surface, they seem true, though, because it's just common sense. They must be true, right? Surely more people coming into America means they gotta live in houses, so they're gonna buy up all the houses or live in all of the rental places. They're gonna take all the jobs because they're gonna need jobs, right? Like, these talking points sound like they're true if you are a layperson at the topic. If you can only look at the surface level, it seems like a, you know, it seems like an easy question. Yeah, of course, more people coming to America means jobs and housing become more scarce and people suffer. Like, duh. It's very easy to get people to believe that. It just kind of makes sense if you only look at it from the most surface level of surface levels.
Fair representation, and I loosely based it off something Trump said at his State of the Union address all the way back in 2019.
Meanwhile, working class Americans are left to pay the price for mass illegal immigration. Reduced jobs, lower wages, overburdened schools, hospitals that are so crowded you can't get in, increased crime, and a depleted social safety net.
And this also happens to be something our good friend Asmongold has talked about on his stream too.
And you're also taking those jobs away from citizens that are here. And also, yeah, good point. Where do they live? Well, they live in houses. Well, okay, well, we have people that don't have houses that are in the country now. Well, what the fuck? Like, I mean, it's just, this is not even a question.
And look, I think it's safe to say
that is the deepest you will ever see Asmongold delve into a topic. If he ever, like, finds himself wondering about something, rarely will he just Google it to try and get an answer. He'll just ask his chat and go with whatever answer they give him. It's depressing, bro. It is very depressing.
That the vast majority of conservatives agree with some form of this logic that we've seen from both Trump and Asmongold. There is a limited pool of resources, whether it be jobs, government welfare, or housing, and illegal immigrants / mass migration puts a strain on those resources, which negatively affects everybody in the country. On its surface, this feels like it could be a plausible common sense take, but unfortunately, these claims are either 1, outright incorrect, or 2, so misleading to a point which is downright deceitful. So, to get a better idea of the complex—
And knowing Asmongold, because I used to actually be a fan of him, he's probably just genuinely unable to look beyond the surface level. I think he has been legitimately radicalized by a variety of things, and a lot of this isn't even him being radicalized, it's him engaging with these topics with the level of nuance that is expected nowadays, which is none. And if you look at these topics with zero nuance, you end up at the positions Asmongold expresses.
Complexity which underpins an issue like immigration, let's take a deeper look point by point. We'll start with the jobs argument first. Conservatives are 50% correct when they say immigrants are taking jobs from native-born workers, but they're ignoring the other half of that equation. Now, hopefully this isn't too much of a shock, but it actually turns out that migrants have to sustain their own existence in the exact same way that a native-born citizen does. That means buying food for their families, paying rent to live somewhere, and purchasing a whole host of goods and services, which brings an additional level of consumption to the economy, which wouldn't otherwise exist.
This is very important to keep in mind in regards to particularly America. You could make the argument that some other countries, particularly European ones, might not fare as well from the temporary drawbacks of immigration. But in America's case, in particular, being such a service-based economy, more people in America means more jobs. Because America, we don't do manufacturing. We don't do the kinds of jobs here that are finite. We do the kind of jobs here that scale with the amount of people in America. More people in America means more people that need to be serviced by our mostly service industry economy. And then, of course, the fact that there are more people working more jobs means there's more spending money, which always ends up benefiting the economy. This is the sort of the self-feeding cycle that has allowed America's economic growth to be non-stop year-on-year, or not even year-on-year, quarter-on-quarter increase for most of America's existence up until when Trump took office, of course. More people here means more work to do. We don't do the type of work in America that means more people here means there's less jobs to do. More people here means there's more jobs to do. We're a service-based economy, not a manufacturing economy.
Result, businesses have to start producing more stuff due to this extra economic activity, and would you look at that, we're creating new job opportunities. This is something economists have known for a while, and this misconception even has a name, the lump of labor fallacy. It's wrong to think—
Dude, it feels so good when you find out a thing the right does that's frustrating and annoying, that there's been a name for that for probably hundreds of years. It's like, they figured that out a while ago, thank God. There's a word for this, yes. I love when I find out there's a word for something like this, the lump of labor fallacy. I need to, like, commit that to memory.
Of an economy as a fixed pie in which there's a finite amount of work to be done and you're fighting with other people to get your share. No, they're much more fluid than that, and the amount of work to be done scales with the level of economic activity and production.
That's what I
For example,
said.
when women began entering—
It's like, it scales directly, and it's a self-feeding loop. The more people you bring in through immigration, the more work there is to be done. The more people that need houses means the more construction work there is to be done. What the United States really needs to do is what Biden did, but even more hardcore, which is dedicating a significant amount of federal funding to paying contracts out to construction companies to build, well, for the people, for the cities and states and property developers, free housing. But in the case of the US government, they're paying the construction workers and the construction companies to make said housing. That is the way you get people, and give bonuses for construction companies bringing in more workers. Give them bonuses if they bring in workers without a high school diploma. Like that. That's the way you improve the situation. But that requires nuance. That requires actually giving a fuck enough to look into the issue.
In the workforce in the 1960s, there was a big fear that they'd be taking jobs away from men. I mean, think about it. If you're about to have millions of people flood the labor force, surely that has to come at the expense of male employment, right? Well, no, actually. More people working meant more people earning money and consuming, which meant the economy began growing, which meant more jobs were being created.
And this is... I don't know if this is the case for other countries. I can't speak for, like, the UK, or Australia, or New Zealand, or Austria, or Germany, or Sweden, or I can't speak for any of these countries because I don't know what their economies are all about. But I know that the US does not really do manufacturing. It's not our thing. We don't... Like, most jobs... Like, think of 100 jobs and write them down in a notebook, and think about how many of those jobs, if you're American, that are popular here in America, have nothing to do with making anything, and entirely have to do with providing a service of some kind to someone. And the more someones there are to provide service to, the more work you have to do. And if there was just so many someones, and it was too much work for you, your employer would have to hire more people to provide service to those someones, meaning more jobs have been created. Like, most jobs in America are that kind of job. Not the kind where it's like, well, we gotta make this many cars, and we only have this many positions to work at the factory, so more people coming into America means more people competing over a finite number of jobs. This is not how America is, in particular.
A look at the rates of employment for men and women aged between 25 and 54 over the last 60 years. Now sure, there has been a slight decrease in male employment over time from 92% to 86%, but as economist Paul Krugman notes, this is due to a decline in manufacturing and other industries which have been lost thanks to globalization. And this is the same thing we view when it comes to immigration, and it's proven by study after study after study. I mean, hell, if you look at the US specifically, immigrants are 80% more likely to start a business compared to their native counterparts.
I didn't know that. That is a handy stat. Immigrants are 80% more likely to establish a business than US-born citizens, meaning that a significant number of immigrants are starting businesses and creating jobs that, statistically speaking, would most likely be getting worked by native-born Americans. So there is a case to be made that for a decent percentage of them, every one immigrant that comes into America creates, God, 3, 4, 5, maybe more jobs for native-born American citizens. I didn't even factor that in. Because it's true. Most people who immigrate to America, especially depending on the country, statistically, are way more likely to start a business, and they're way more likely to be well off just from the fact that they have the resources and means to immigrate to America. If you got what you need to be able to get here to America, you probably have what you need to start a business. And a pretty decent little successful family business, too.
Leading to higher levels of overall employment than there otherwise would be, which is supported by some of the latest research too. Now, if you want to go into the gritty details, you could argue that immigration does displace workers in the immediate short term, but that's not the type of nuance people are wanting to work with when they're chanting, immigrants are stealing our jobs. So yeah, this is the first common sense take, which doesn't hold up to scrutiny. Now, wages are a slightly more complicated story. If we're using the basic economic theory of supply and demand, then we'd expect to see wages to fall when there's an influx of new labor in the economy thanks to migration, but this isn't really reflected in the empirical evidence. If we take a look at this meta-analysis from 2024, which pulls together 42 different studies, they conclude that immigration's effect on wages is close to zero and often not statistically significant. This older meta-analysis from 2010 found something similar, with the wage and employment effects of an immigration shock being very small. Or here, a study from the Reserve Bank of Australia in 2019 found that we typically do not see large effects of immigration on wages, and the effects these studies do find are often positive. And again, one final meta-analysis from 2014 concluded that most estimates are
This literally backs up everything that I've read about this as well, and I haven't even seen a lot of these particular studies he's showing, and these are pretty legit, but they back up everything that I've seen as well. There is really no debate among economists, left or right. It's like a bipartisan agreement among economists that if your goal is to see greater economic productivity and prosperity in America, you should not oppose immigration, because it creates more of all those good things. Economists do not argue over that. That is settled reality that economists just accept, because it's blatantly obvious. It's as obvious as it's just common sense.
Small, and, on average, essentially zero. Now, this is obviously a little reductive to the nuances here, as immigration and its effect on the economy is extremely context dependent. For example, that RBA study I mentioned earlier found that immigration was actually helping to reduce inequality here in Australia. Because our immigration policy favors high-skilled labor, that increases the level of competition around high-skilled job openings, which was found to slightly reduce those wages whilst disproportionately increasing the wages of low-skilled workers. Therefore, in an Australian context, we actually found that immigration had a positive effect on the wages of working-class people. Now, to be clear, that seemed to be more of an isolated example from what I was able to read, so let's hone in.
This has also been found in America because, well, it means that you have to... a lot of people in America who work service jobs, which is most Americans by like a massive margin, can work overtime paid if that overtime needs to be worked. Hell, in some cases, if you're at your job, you might get double overtime, depending on like certain situations where you get double paid and you're working overtime, where you get double paid for the hours overtime that you work. That was my favorite thing when I was a lifeguard. If I was ever offered an extra shift to work back to back from my previous one for double overtime, I was like, yes, please. And I'm glad I did, because eventually I used that money to build my first ever PC that I made content on. Not my first ever PC, but the first PC I ever made content on. It's pretty cool.
On the general consensus here. At worst, immigration has...
But when your job is serving people, and that's most American jobs, more people, more immigrants means more overtime, more double overtime, higher wages. Well, not higher wages necessarily, but the workers are making more money.
Has a slightly deflationary effect on the wages of working class people, but this is massively outweighed by the benefits it provides to the economy more generally. And hey, as someone who actually cares about the material conditions of the working class, that's an important caveat. In fact, I'd say that's a great political discussion to be had, as we should redistribute the economic gains of immigration such that everyone is better off in society, but do you really think that's the level of nuance you're going to get from a political commentator like Asmongold? My common sense says no. So yes, whilst immigration...
I need you guys to stop for a moment and just really stew on the fact that the world's largest political pundit, the most listened to guy on the internet when it comes to political takes, uses a dead rat next to his bed as an alarm clock. Because when the sun starts hitting it, like in the early morning when the sun comes through the window, it like heats up the dead rat and activates the smell of the dead rat, I guess you could say. And so he wakes up to like the fermenting dead rat smell. But at night, I guess, the rat dries up and desiccates. And so you can't smell it as much, or at least he can't. And so he goes to bed. But the smell of the rat in the sunbeams coming through his window wakes him up every morning. He has a smellarm clock, exactly.
Can cause a negligible decrease in the wages of working class people, though not always, and can sometimes actually increase them. This downside is massively overblown by critics and fails to consider the enormous benefit which immigrants provide to the economy more generally. Now, thirdly and finally, I want to touch on the claim Asmongold made about housing, as no, immigrants are definitely not the issue here. This is probably the misconception which annoys me the most as an Australian, because we are experiencing the literal worst housing crisis in the world right now, and people love to use immigration as an easy scapegoat. I actually made a video on this topic earlier in the year, but the idea that migrants are to blame for housing unaffordability is a complete red herring which ignores the true structural issues at play. Here in Australia, current planning restrictions prevent medium and high density dwellings from being built. There's a criminal lack of public housing.
This is true in America as well. There are a lot of zoning rules that say, oh, this area is only for businesses. This is like for Europeans, Australians, etc., non-Americans listening to this, I need you to wrap your head around this, okay? Imagine a city planning system where certain areas are considered residential and certain areas are considered commercial. Commercial areas are where you're allowed to have businesses. It's where all the businesses are at. Long stretches of road with strip malls and single large buildings of businesses, different stores, restaurants, and they're usually just like a big wall of parking lot between the road and those businesses, right? And you gotta have a car to get to these places with ease. They're made to access by car. It's why all of the businesses in a given area tend to be on a long stretch of road through town in the like commercial area. Outside of that, you get the residential area, where it's oftentimes just sprawling suburbs for blocks and blocks and blocks and blocks, to the point where, depending on where you live, it is not uncommon that if you just live in a little neighborhood, if you look on Google Maps and try to like figure out how long the walk is to get to your nearest corner store or grocery store, it might be more than a 10 to 20 minute walk. It's probably going to be between a 10 and 20 minute walk just to get there, probably more, and it's definitely going to take you double to get back, because we're not accounting for there and back. That doesn't sound so bad if you're American, like, oh, a 20-minute walk to the grocery store? Hell, that's pretty good. But if you're European, you're probably like, what? It shouldn't take you more than like 5 minutes to get to a corner store or any place where you could buy food at least, right? And a lot of Europeans are used to this like high density, like you've got businesses right next to residences, which allows for a lot more walkability. That alone allows for so much walkability. America's pretty fine when it comes to the amount of sidewalks. There's enough sidewalks for the most part in American towns and cities. It's just you have to walk for miles to get from residential to business areas, to commercial areas. That's not how you should plan out cities if you want them to be walkable. If anything, every block or two, there should be a commercial area surrounded by residential if you want to keep things uniform and equal. But the way it's currently laid out, it's rough, man. It's rough. I got a little stun locked on this, but walkable cities are one of my passionate things to talk about, so had to let myself get stun locked there.
We have awful tax incentives in place which make real estate a stupidly profitable investment, and there's a shortage.
Oh, my main point, by the way, I remember why I got stun locked on that. My main point was the urban sprawl that I was talking about, that like those residential areas oftentimes are big lots, these big lots of land that are like, I don't even know how much, like I'd say 20 yards by, on average, maybe 80 yards, maybe 30 by 80 yards. You can imagine these lots all over the place. That is very often the size of the average like property owned by either a company or an individual. And when they develop on these lots, they're always developing these singular houses made for a single family to live in with a lot of room around them that's all to themselves. And it's just block after block of that leads directly to business areas. And this means that so much of this land in cities and towns are not being used to build high-density housing. They're not building apartments, they're building houses. And they're building those houses for wealthy people, oftentimes those who already own the land. So houses are getting built. The problem is we need apartments to be getting built. We need rental places that are cheapish and affordable while also being up to a decent enough standard, you know, to be made. We need a lot of them. We need a large volume of them. Right now, the insistence on building houses instead of apartments is fucking us hard.
Of labor and supplies to actually build houses in the first place. These are the predominant issues at the heart of the housing crisis, not immigration. In fact, when 49 leading economists were asked to pick their preferred solution, only 6% of them said to restrain immigration, the third lowest response overall. Now, of course, more people coming into a country is going to increase the level of demand for housing, and nobody is denying that. However, to treat that as the foremost factor in housing unaffordability is delusional, as you could literally halt all immigration tomorrow, and guess what? We'd still have a housing crisis because of those other structural issues we mentioned earlier. Now, obviously, I'm talking about an Australian context here, but a lot of these points ring true for an American one as well. There is consensus amongst US economists that immigration is not one of the major factors driving house prices, and in fact, because so many migrants who move to the country are construction workers, they're probably having an outsized effect on the supply of housing rather than the demand. And, just like Australia, restrictive zoning laws and high construction costs have resulted in a housing shortage, and soaring mortgage rates have made things completely unaffordable. So when a Republican senator like Carrie...
Don't forget, soaring rent rates, dude. Like, rent has been going up like crazy. Bring back that one guy who's like, the rent is too damn high. We should have elected him. He should have been the governor of New York. How did New Yorkers not elect the guy whose campaign catchphrase was "the rent is too damn high"? New Yorkers, how could anybody reach out and speak to you on what you care about most more than that? What are your priorities? What are your priorities that you didn't vote for the guy whose campaign slogan was "the rent is too damn high"?
says, it's just basic common sense, these people have to live somewhere, and this is basic supply and demand, they are being deliberately obtuse to the actual issues at play here. I mean, come on, look no further than the early stages of COVID back in 2020. Even when international travel was non-existent, property prices in most developed nations absolutely skyrocketed, despite the flow of migrants halting entirely. So, although immigration is certainly a demand-side factor when it comes to house prices and rent, it's often used as a red herring to distract you from the true structural causes which are actually to blame for housing unaffordability. So, would you look at that? When we break down the common sense arguments against immigration, they turn out to be either 1, categorically incorrect, or 2, intentionally misleading or massively overblown. Now, the funny thing is,
and when you want to intentionally mislead without being able, when you're trying to intentionally mislead someone, the less you say, the better. So what better to say less than simply calling your logic common sense and refusing to elaborate further? It's the perfect coverall phrase.
Everything I just said, I wouldn't blame you for thinking I'm some globalist, pro-mass immigration, lefty loony, but that simply isn't the case. There's obviously going to be a level of immigration which is detrimental to both the person who wants to move to a country and the native citizens who are already there. And I don't want that. But that's not really my main point here. Just like that one really annoying math teacher you had in 7th grade who insisted that you showed you're working when you solve an equation, I'm concerned with the process people are using to arrive at their political convictions, or more accurately, the lack thereof. When your understanding of the world is merely a pastiche of Twitter hot takes and Reddit clips woven together with your deeply flawed intuitions, well, that's how you end up going off the deep end, ranting that Palestinians deserve to be genocided.
And the worst part is, the algorithms that decide who gets to discover what content, or even know what content exists online, are all rewarding the most bottom-of-the-barrel, low-effort, low-reliability reporting on any issue imaginable. The more nuanced and truthful you are, the less the algorithms like it. And I'm not saying this to, bitch or whatever. Hell, my channel's actually been doing better lately. Maybe that means that my content's getting less truthful. But, in general, though, the algorithms, don't really reward truthfulness. They really don't. Mostly, for the most part, every website out there, barring a few, the dominating content is just the most sloppish, brain-dead nonsense, bro. It is so cringe what dominates the algorithms, and the fact that, nobody gives a fuck to hear the truth, or to frankly, to hear, a nuanced take of an issue. It's sad. These platforms we all go to for our entertainment and our news, unfortunately, it kind of feeds directly into, they reward this problem.
On that note, actually, the scariest thing about a political commentator like Asmongold is that he doesn't seem to care that this is his process of arriving at the truth. When someone in his chat directly challenged him over the fact that he doesn't seem to do any research to arrive at his political beliefs, this is how he responded.
No, you think and feel a lot. I've never seen you actually do some research. Why would I need to do research? I already know it. Yeah, I just come to conclusions. And then they're right. Pretty much every single time.
At first, I thought
he is definitely playing into it a little ironic there, but that's also not that ironic because that's what he does. Like, that's how he operates, whether he's saying that as a joke or not.
he was joking here and actually laughed because, based alert, who the fuck needs to do research when you're always right? But then he continues.
Like, if it's such a bad idea to do that, then why do I keep coming out with positive outcomes? You really think that all these people coming from countries that have totally different laws and the ways that they treat women over there, you really think that there's not going to be an increase in bad behavior in that area? Especially when there's no vetting properly to make sure the ones that are acting in good faith or not? You don't need to have statistics for that. It's common sense. Like, I don't need to see 50 different studies to know if you put a wolf in a cage with 10 rabbits, there's not going to be 10 rabbits by the end of the day. I don't need to have like 50 fucking studies of this. I don't need to have a million levels of data and representation for it. It's common fucking a priori knowledge that every single reasonable person knows. Sorry. It's just the way it is.
Oh my god, he wasn't fucking joking. This is the most influential political streamer in the world. And
never forget that. The most influential. Not joking when I say the algorithms reward this shit.
This is unironically what he thinks about academia. The situation he just described of how cultures can potentially clash when people immigrate is quite literally the purpose of studies and why they're so useful. Like, seriously, conducting a natural experiment around a population that experiences an increase of immigrants and analyzing the consequences of that sounds like the single most useful thing you could have to have a more informed opinion on this topic. I know that's a little different to watching one video of an anti-immigration protest in the UK and basing your worldview on that, but unfortunately, a study like this would be a much more accurate representation of reality. Dismissing the possibility that a study could be useful here by going, oh, actually, if you put a wolf in the cage, it's gonna eat a rabbit, it's gonna eat a rabbit. And then using your common sense is like actually so insane, I'm kinda at a loss for words.
The grifting is unreal. He's not grifting. Asmongold is actually that dumb. If you go back and you watch his old gaming content, he used the same kind of logic. When Asmongold was oftentimes right when talking about games, he was often wrong too, don't get me wrong. Don't make no mistake. He was wrong all the time. I'm not trying to glaze old Asmongold here. But when talking about games, I mean, he was a subject matter expert, more or less. He oftentimes had relatively good takes. Forget that time that he spent like 20 minutes failing to pass through the tutorial of that one game. Meanwhile, he's the guy who claims gaming journalists aren't real, are like ruining gaming and are scammers or whatever. Regardless, though, it is kind of his subject matter expertise, right? He's a gamer, and his instincts when it comes to commentary on any kind of scandal or news in the gaming industry is usually relatively on point. And so he felt confident that using that same thought process in politics would serve him just as well. He even said, when defending himself there, if my logic wasn't good, then why is it causing me so many good outcomes? Why am I so successful and popular if my logic isn't good? It's their go-to argument. If the left was right, wouldn't the left be more successful? Checkmate, libtard. Anyway, folks, if you want to see more of that video, please go click the link in the description, drop a like and a comment and a sub on that channel. I thought that video was fantastic, and I quite enjoyed it. And there's still more for you to watch on your own if you want to go give it a view. And of course, if you liked my video and you want to see more and you want to, support my channel, consider leaving a like and a comment. Whether you're watching live right now as I'm live streaming, it really helps. Every single thumbs up means the world. Or in the future when this goes out as its own video. I appreciate the likes, thank you for the comments, and thank you for the subs. Don't forget to follow my social medias, linked down below in the description, and if you want to support me directly, financially, help me keep a roof above my head and the lights on here at the Xander Hall studio, then consider donating, subscribing, gifting a sub on my website, xanderhall.com/live, or supporting me through YouTube, Twitch, Streamlabs, Stream Elements, or Patreon. Regardless of how you support me though, thank you all so much for watching, as always, and have a good one.